Welcome to Silent Screams. In today's video, we'll be diving into a chilling real-life experience shared by someone who found themselves living with a housemate they found on Craigslist. It started as a simple search for a place to live, something many of us have done. But as you'll soon discover, sometimes the people we let into our homes have hidden agendas that we could never have imagined. Prepare yourself for a story that's sure to make you think twice before ever trusting a stranger with your living space. It all began with an innocent ad posted on Craigslist. Emily had just moved to a new city, and after weeks of searching for an affordable apartment, she finally found a listing for a room in a house that seemed perfect. The price was reasonable, the location was great, and the landlord seemed friendly enough over the phone. The only catch? She would be sharing the house with a housemate named Derek, a man who had been living there for the past few months. At first, Emily didn't think much of it. She had heard stories about odd roommates before, but she assumed it would be no different from the other shared living situations she had been in over the years. She had no reason to believe that anything was amiss. When she first met Derek, he seemed harmless. He was polite, soft-spoken, and a little shy, but there was something unsettling about his demeanor, something that made her uncomfortable in ways she couldn't quite explain. The first few days in the house were uneventful, but Emily soon began to notice strange things happening around her. It started with small things, objects that seemed to move on their own, lights that flickered for no reason, and the unsettling feeling that someone, or something, was watching her. At first, she brushed it off. Maybe the house was just old, or perhaps her mind was playing tricks on her. After all, she was in a new place, and it wasn't unusual to feel a little off-kilter in unfamiliar surroundings. But then, things started to escalate. Emily began hearing strange noises in the middle of the night, scratching sounds that seemed to come from the walls, whispers in the dark, faint footsteps in the hallway when no one was supposed to be there. She would wake up in the early hours of the morning with a feeling of dread settling over her, as though she weren't alone in the room, even though Derek was fast asleep in his bedroom down the hall. The atmosphere in the house began to feel oppressive, as though the very walls were closing in on her. She tried to ignore it at first, but as the days went on, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. One evening, while Derek was out, Emily decided to investigate. She had noticed that his bedroom door was always slightly ajar, as though he wanted her to see inside, but she had never been brave enough to take a look. That night, however, curiosity got the better of her. She quietly crept down the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. When she reached Derek's door, she hesitated for a moment, but then pushed it open. The room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of a lamp in the corner. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she noticed something strange on the walls. At first, she thought it was just shadows, but as she stepped closer, she realized it was something much more sinister, scratches. Deep, jagged scratches that ran up and down the walls, as though something, or someone, had been clawing at them for days, if not weeks. But that wasn't the most unsettling part. In the corner of the room, there was a large, ornate mirror. It was covered in a thick layer of dust, but when Emily wiped it away, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Her reflection, no, not her reflection, was standing still, but there was something else in the mirror. It was Derek, but his eyes were completely black, empty sockets where his pupils should have been, and his mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile. Emily stumbled back, gasping for air, and the image in the mirror disappeared. She slammed the door shut and ran back to her room, her heart racing, her mind struggling to process what she had just seen. Was it just a trick of the light? Had she imagined it? Or was something more sinister at work here? That night, Emily couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt a cold, malevolent presence hovering just beyond the edge of her consciousness. The whispers in the walls seemed to grow louder, more insistent, and she could have sworn she heard someone, or something, moving around in the house. It felt like the house itself was alive, watching her, waiting for the right moment to strike. The next morning, Derek was acting strangely. He was more withdrawn than usual, avoiding eye contact and speaking in short, clipped sentences. Emily tried to ask him about the scratches on the wall, but he just shrugged it off, acting as though nothing was out of the ordinary. The tension between them was palpable, and Emily could feel that something was wrong, but she couldn't figure out what it was. Then, things took a darker turn. One evening, after coming home from work, Emily found the house completely silent. Normally, she would hear Derek moving around, making dinner or watching TV, but tonight, there was nothing. She called out his name, but there was no answer. Slowly, she began to walk through the house, her footsteps echoing in the empty space. When she reached the kitchen, she stopped dead in her tracks. There, in the middle of the room, was a large, wooden chair facing the wall. It was positioned perfectly, as though someone had been sitting there, waiting. And then, she heard it. A soft, scratching noise, coming from the wall. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she approached the wall, and when she placed her hand on it, the scratching stopped. She pulled away, her mind racing. She had to get out of this house. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew one thing. For sure, Derek wasn't who he appeared to be. She packed her things quickly, her hands shaking as she gathered her belongings. As she turned to leave, the front door slammed shut with a deafening crash, trapping her inside. The house groaned, the walls shifting as though something deep within them was moving, something ancient, something evil. She backed away from the door, her eyes darting around the room. Derek appeared in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes wide with something that was almost hunger. Leaving so soon, he asked in a voice that was no longer his own. It was deeper, rougher, filled with something monstrous. Emily tried to scream, but no sound came out. She turned and ran, the house shaking with every step she took, the walls closing in on her, the air thick with the scent of decay. She had to get out. She had to survive. As she reached the front door, she tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through her, and she screamed for help, but there was no answer. No one could hear her. She was alone. And then, through the crack in the door, she saw it. The reflection of Derek in the window. But this time, he wasn't standing. He was floating, his limbs twisted at unnatural angles, his mouth open wide in a horrifying scream that echoed through the house. The last thing Emily saw before she was consumed by darkness was the figure of Derek stepping toward her, his eyes black as night, his mouth opening wider and wider until it seemed to engulf the entire room. As Emily's desperate hand gripped the door handle, trying to escape the suffocating presence of whatever lurked within the house, a sudden force hit her from behind. It wasn't like anything she had felt before, no human force, no blow or push. It felt as if the very air around her had turned solid, like something invisible but powerful was holding her back. Her breath caught in her throat. She was trapped. Turning slowly, Emily faced the man, no, the thing that had once been Derek. His body was still, but his eyes, they were not his own. The black voids where his pupils had once been glimmered with an unnatural, menacing light. His mouth was stretched open unnaturally wide, as if it were trying to consume her very soul. His smile, if it could even be called that, was grotesque, filled with jagged, sharp teeth that weren't there before. And his skin, pale, waxy, stretched tight over his bones, looked as though it belonged to something older than time itself. Emily staggered backward, her heart pounding in her chest, but every step she took felt like she was sinking deeper into quicksand. The house, it seemed, was alive, its walls pulsating, the air thick and sticky, making it harder to breathe. The oppressive atmosphere weighed heavily on her, making her feel small, insignificant, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. The thing that was once Derek took a step forward. His eyes glowed with an otherworldly intensity as he tilted his head, as if savoring the fear radiating from Emily. His voice, if it could be called a voice, came in low, guttural tones, like the rasping whispers of 100 voices trapped in the same breath. "You're not leaving," he said, his voice more growl than speech. "This house needs you. It wants you." Emily wanted to scream. She wanted to run. But the words were stuck in her throat, her body frozen in terror. Something deep within her told her that if she moved, if she even dared to speak, something worse would happen. She was caught in the web of this cursed place, and Derek, if it was still even Derek, was its puppet master. The lights in the room flickered again, casting strange, elongated shadows that twisted on the walls. It felt like time itself was bending, slowing, warping, and the longer Emily stared at Derek's hollow eyes, the more she felt herself being pulled into them, as though they were opening up into an endless void that would swallow her whole. The scratching sound started again, faint at first, then growing louder, echoing throughout the house. It wasn't coming from the walls anymore. No, it was coming from inside the house, beneath the floorboards, from the ceiling. It felt like the house was alive, breathing, shifting in ways that defied logic. There were things in the house, things she could not see, but she could feel them, creeping, waiting, watching. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the room, carrying with it a smell. It was like rotting meat, mixed with something metallic, like blood that had been sitting in the sun too long. The air thickened, and the temperature plummeted, as if something ancient had stirred in the bowels of the house. Emily's skin crawled, goosebumps breaking out across her arms. She could see her breath misting in the frigid air, but there was no explanation for the sudden drop in temperature. Then she saw it, out of the corner of her eye, a shadow, quick and fleeting, darting across the hallway. Something large, something with a grotesque, misshapen form. Emily turned her head sharply, but it was gone before she could focus on it, leaving only the faintest echo of its presence lingering in the air, like a whisper of something far too dark to understand. Derek's voice rumbled again, low and ominous, his words heavy with malice. "You're not the first," he said, taking another slow, deliberate step toward her. "Others have come and gone. All of them too weak to understand what lies beneath this place. What lives here. You're different, though. You've been chosen." The coldness deepened, and Emily felt it, a pull in the pit of her stomach, as though something was trying to drag her into the very foundation of the house, into the walls, into the floor, into the darkness beneath the house. She could hear it now, the soft, rhythmic sound of something shifting beneath her feet, something huge, something ancient, something that had been waiting for a long, long time. She took a shaky step back, her hands trembling as they fumbled for the doorknob again. It was no use. The door wouldn't open. The handle had turned to ice, as though frozen by some supernatural force. Her pulse quickened, her mind racing for any way out. "Why me?" Emily gasped, her voice barely a whisper. The question hung in the air, desperate, raw. She had to know. Why was she chosen? Why had Derek, or whatever he had become, targeted her? Derek's expression twisted, the grotesque smile widening, stretching beyond what was humanly possible. "Because you're special," he said softly, his voice dripping with an unnatural, oily sweetness. "You felt it, haven't you? The pull. The connection. You're like the others, but you belong here. You're part of something greater, something far beyond the human realm. This house has been waiting for you. We have all been waiting for you." Before Emily could ask him to explain further, the house seemed to groan, as if it were waking up, shifting its weight beneath her feet. She could hear the walls creaking, the floorboards shifting and bending. It was as though the house had a mind of its own, like it was alive, pulsing with a strange, ancient energy that was older than anything she could comprehend. Suddenly, the shadows in the corners of the room began to move, flickering, twisting, and growing. The darkness itself seemed to come alive, crawling toward her like a living thing, stretching out like fingers, reaching for her, seeking her. Emily could feel it now, something cold, ancient, and evil trying to touch her, to pull her into the void where Derek and his twisted reality had come from. The whispering began again, louder this time, filling the room with hundreds of voices, all speaking at once in languages that Emily couldn't understand, their tones pleading, begging, demanding. It was overwhelming. The words clawed at her mind, drowning her in a sea of incomprehensible noise. She could feel her sanity slipping away, her grip on reality becoming more tenuous with every passing second. Derek's laugh, dark and cruel, filled the room. It wasn't his own laugh, it was deeper, more guttural, like the sound of something monstrous trapped inside of him, laughing in joy at her fear. "You should have never come here," he said, his voice shifting into a low, rattling hiss. "Now, you'll join us." The room seemed to shift around her, the walls warping and bending, stretching, until they felt like they were closing in, squeezing her, forcing her to her knees. The weight of the air became unbearable, suffocating. The house was alive, and it was angry that she had defied it. Emily could feel her body growing weak, her limbs heavy, her vision blurring as if the very space around her was folding in on itself. The shadows loomed larger, darker, until they completely consumed the light. All she could hear was the roar of the voices, the shrill whispering from within the walls, and the thumping of her heart, which was growing quieter, slower. Suddenly, a flash of light pierced the darkness, a beam of pure, white light, brighter than anything Emily had ever seen, cutting through the shadows. She looked up, blinking against the sudden brightness, and saw something she couldn't believe. A figure stood in the doorway, bathed in that blinding light. It was a man, tall, cloaked in what appeared to be an ancient robe. His face was hidden, but the power radiating from him was palpable. He was the source of the light, the thing that had pierced through the suffocating darkness. Without a word, the figure moved toward her, and the oppressive weight of the house seemed to lift ever so slightly, as though the air itself had become less heavy. Derek, or whatever it was now, screeched in rage, stepping back. The shadows recoiled as if they were afraid of the figure, and for a moment, Emily felt something she hadn't felt since she entered this house: hope. The figure raised his hand, and the shadows recoiled, retreating back into the corners, vanishing like smoke. The house groaned, its walls shaking, as though it were protesting the intrusion. Derek, now nothing more than a wretched, corrupted shell, let out a final, blood-curdling scream before he vanished into the air, dissolving like dust in the wind. But Emily wasn't free yet. Something told her this was far from over,